that Barack Obama is absolutely necessary even in this country, because this is exactly the time when Africans should be looking for alternative solutions to the Democratic Party and to the U.S. system itself. This is the time that real revolutionaries have been organizing for and have been going out into the communities to deal with as this crisis deepens. We know this is our time. We know that people are becoming more and more conscious every day of the contradiction, and therefore the doors have to be open to allow them in. And to bring them in. But what has happened instead is Barack Obama becomes the Pied Piper for imperialism. So that as opposed to looking for solutions outside of the social system that's victimizing them so seriously, they turn to the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party now has this Negro representative in the form of Barack Obama. And he is not the first one they've used in that fashion. Jesse Jackson played the same role in the past. At the time of deepening crisis of imperialism, as opposed to people finding their solution and organizing themselves independently of an imperialist solution, they found themselves back into the safe embrace of a Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is the party of imperialism, has always been the party of imperialism. So here is the situation. The other thing is that the crisis of imperialism is one that represents itself globally. It's not just something that happens in our communities. It's an incredibly significant crisis. Because one aspect of it, profoundly, is that imperialism itself is experiencing crisis. But also the U.S., which has been the center of imperialism at least since the Second Imperialist War, is not only experiencing crisis, but the crisis is of such a nature that it becomes even more contentious in its relationship with imperialist partners, because there is no honor among thieves. Even though they are united as imperialists on the one hand, they are constantly in competition with each other for the resources of the world. And so you have the United States and having a different direct and immediate interest. All of them are interested in dominating the world, but the United States have a direct and immediate interest that is different from the interest of France, for example, dealing with some particular question. The United States is even with Iraq being one of the examples, because Iraq has its own interest in, France has its own interest in exploiting the resources of Iraq. And then there's the U.S. that has its interest, and France. Remember when people refused to eat French fries, or to call them French fries, because of this contention there. And so you have all over Africa, you have wars, the proxy wars that have been fought over the last several years between France and the United States for control of Africa. Even with what we saw with Rwanda, even with what we saw in Congo in terms of overthrowing Mobutu, was a part of this contest between France and the United States. For even what you see happening in Ivory Coast at different times is a part of the contest between France and the United States for control of resources in Africa. So there is this contention even within the imperialist camp itself that is a part of the crisis of imperialism. Then you have, of course, the fact that neo-colonialism it has been fast biting the dust around the world. Some of the leaders of that movement, of course, you know, we saw with Vietnam, and we saw with Cuba, and etc. We saw with Nicaragua that had setbacks and other places, overthrowing these stooges in their own communities that represented imperialism, neo-colonialism, in another imperialism with another face. But now there's been a groundswell. So at one juncture it looked like Cuba was alone. Remember how everybody was saying the imperialists were chanting and grinning and skinning about, you know, when Fidel dies, how it's all going to be over? And then, of course, it's not like that anymore. You know, there's Venezuela now. There's Ecuador now. There's Bolivia. There's increasing numbers of forces in South America who are taking back resources, deepening the crisis of imperialism. And so it makes it, and then, of course, there was even a Saddam Hussein. And this is one of the things I have so many problems with the so-called peace movement in this country, you know. which is one of the reasons why I think the Black is Back a coalition for social justice, peace, and reparations was so important, because it was a peace movement that could not condemn imperialism. It could only condemn imperialist acts or some policy or another of imperialism, as if imperialism could act any different than it does today. I mean, people have been complaining, the peace movement in this country has been complaining about one war after the other forever. They complain about the so-called Spanish-American War. They complain about the U.S. attack that stole part of Mexico. But they could not complain about imperialism. And that has been their weakness. And one reason they can't complain about imperialism is because the empire has its origin in the theft in this country, of this land, that was built up by the stolen labor of African people ourselves. So they have this problem. They can be opposed to a particular policy because their policy pinches their toes, but not against imperialism as such. They can be opposed to imperialist exportation of jobs and things like that to other countries, because it means the middle class here, white middle class, is losing some of their resources, but they can't be opposed to imperialism. Our attack is against imperialism itself, and it cannot represent itself to us in any way that makes it something that we can appreciate, that we can say is all right. And so imperialism is in a state of crisis. And then you have, Iraq, and I mentioned, the peace movement, because it is sometimes a movement that wants to say, that's even willing to say that Saddam was a bad guy, right? Because they don't even pretend anymore that there were so-called weapons of mass destruction. And for me, the issue of mass destruction in Iraq, there should be a criticism of the Iraqi government, because there were none. I mean, the fact is that you're dealing with imperialism that's robbing and looting the world, and they're looking at you, and you don't pick up a penknife. That's something wrong with you. I mean, mine is a criticism of them for not having it, but even after that, that cannot be used any longer as a rationale for the attack of Iraq. They don't even pretend. They don't even have to, because they say that Saddam was a bad guy. And somehow, after killing all those people that they've killed in Iraq, it was all worth doing it. After murdering all those, and that's what it was, murder of Iraq. They starved and bombed the people for 12 years. Starved them out. More than 1 million people dead, most of them babies, etc., before they even attacked. And then they go into the country, and now they say, well, there was no weapons of mass destruction, but it was good that we've done it anyway. Afghanistan, where people are so poor that they can hardly afford bread to feed their children. And you have this war. But this is a crisis of imperialism, because it hasn't been the cakewalk that they thought it was going to be. Because people everywhere are resisting, are fighting back, and they can't win. This is the era, Comrade Glenn, this is a magnificent time to be alive and to be struggling. And that is, if we don't make a mistake of accepting the crisis of imperialism as our own crisis. This ain't our problem, this is their problem. And if Obama wants to accept them as his problem, that's his problem. You understand? But that's not our problem. And I think it's really important for us to understand, because this is a critically significant time. Obama becomes necessary because of Hugo Chavez. They need an Obama. Because of the black people in Iraq, they need an Obama. Because all the black and brown and yellow people around the world are rising up saying, kill the white man, kick the white man out. They need an Obama to represent them, because he's not the white man in his own skin, he's the white man in your skin. That's what he is. That's what he is, you see. And so, but this is just a magnificent period to be alive, because this Congress is a part of the resistance. This Congress is a part of the crisis of imperialism. I love it. I'm looking at this congressional hearing, and General Rambo is being questioned about Afghanistan, and he faints. That was incredible. And the bourgeois media said he fainted. They didn't say he passed out, that he lost consciousness. They said he fainted, right? I mean, That's saying something about what Afghanistan is putting on their asses. You know, that he can't even have a discussion with the general. This is the toughest white man on earth, right? Sitting down being questioned about Afghanistan, and he fainted. But we knew about them already, didn't we? We know how tough they are, don't we? Even if we are not organized the way we should be organized, we know who they are. These are the same people who are afraid to come into the black community after dark, who are now running wars, murdering people all over the world, right? And so the guy fainted. And then you had another general, right, who does a interview for a mass bourgeois publication, and said all kind of nasty things about the Obama regime and dealing with the question of what? Afghanistan. Now you know McChrystal knew when he gave that damn interview that he could no longer be the general there. He could no longer run that war. And I think that was his way of surrendering. You understand? I really believe that. I think that was his way of getting out of there. And I believe in that. They said if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. You understand? But most people will say, I can't stand the heat. Well, some people will, and get out of the kitchen. Instead, he said dirty things about the other people. And then he gets fired. He didn't quit. They fired me, you know. And not only did they fire me, but I would have won the war if they'd let me stay. Yeah. That was a self-immolation. He knew he was going to have to go. And Iraq and the resistance of the oppressed peoples around the world did that to him. And guess what? They terrorized some of the people who are not here from Kenya, who were trying to be a part of building the African Socialist International. Comrade Cherno Alpha Mba, who's in this room someplace, who left Sierra Leone and went in to Kenya to organize people who we were talking about. And some of the miserable contacts we had there didn't turn out to be contacts at all that was worth spit. And Comrade Cherno got on a bicycle and rode around Nairobi and organized a committee to build the African Socialist International right there in Kenya. And then Sister Effie, that's SNCC organizing. You understand what I'm talking about? That's SNCC, that's Mississippi all over again. And believe me, it is Mississippi in Kenya. It is dangerous and threatening in Kenya. And then other comrades went in there, you know, to organize in Kenya, because we're going to build a revolution throughout the African world, despite the African petty bourgeoisie, whether they exist here, whether they exist in Kenya, whether they exist any place on earth. African people have to be free. That means we're going to have to take the chances and do what it takes to be free. You see. We went into Kenya, and we couldn't even put a public announcement that we were having a meeting. But even though the state knew we were there, we couldn't publicly announce it, because if we publicly announced it and draw that kind of public attention to it, the state would clearly have moved on us. But we went there, and we had a packed house of people by word of mouth. And we had veterans from the Mau Mau, veterans from the Kenyan Land Freedom Army who fought against the British, who were in those meetings. And they said, this is incredible. This is the first time we can't believe having a public meeting where revolution and socialism is on the agenda in Kenya. And the ASI and the African People's Socialist Party put it on the agenda. Put it on the agenda in Sierra Leone, you see. And we're moving to put it on the agenda throughout the African world. So it is true. You have everybody now moving. The crisis of imperialism, the struggle for resources, the competition between the existing imperialists, and their growing, hungrier, bolder contenders. You look at Africa, for example. In Africa, China is the fastest growing economic force in Africa, followed by India and other entities like that. Africa is the place now that all of them intend to rescue imperialism. It is our responsibility to make sure that Africa becomes the graveyard of imperialism. That's why we have to organize the African Socialist International. That's why we cannot hold the parochial view that sees us somehow understanding that the United States is this place where the solutions to the crisis of African people in any